You're listening to a Life in Quebec podcast. For more, visit lifeinquebec.com.
I'm Andrew Greenfield for lifeinquebec.com, and we're joined now by Stephen Marchessault. Stephen is a history major and has studied the Quebec region extensively. He is a Quebec City tour guide and for years taught the tour guiding course in English at CEGEP St Lawrence. He designed the course and today is responsible for many of the guides who ply their trade here in the city in English. He is considered a subject matter expert, and when it comes to the history of the Quebec region, there's no others like him here. Stephen also wrote the Life in Quebec magazine Quebec City Walking Tour edition. Now, up until recently, to work as a tour guide in Quebec City, you had to be licensed and pass a 150-hour course. The course that he wrote and delivered in English. We're 2 weeks into January 2016, and just before last Christmas, so less than a month ago, the city decided to scrap the licence. Stephen, welcome and thanks for joining us.
Yes, hi Andrew, thank you.
What does it actually entail to become a competent tour guide?
To truly understand the history of the city, but also to understand the different sites in the city, how the sites can relate to the history of the city. So you do need a lot of background information because you must remember that a city tour lasts about 2.5 hours. The course is 150 hours, so obviously there is a lot of background information needed to help people really understand the history of the city. Also, it enables the guides to be able to answer questions. So this is just not like playing a tape where the information goes through. There will be interruptions. People will ask questions which will help them understand at the same time. So you do need a certain amount of good background information to understand. And we are relating 400 years of history at the same time. So we're covering a very large period of time.
Now, the 150 hours of course, over what period of time is that course usually delivered?
Normally it's from early October to about mid-April, approximately. Normally 2 nights a week, about 2.5 hours per course. A few Saturday mornings which allow us to visit museums and get a bit outdoors.
Okay, so, and I'm assuming there was a cost attached to do this course.
Well, the cost at St. Lawrence is $775.
Yeah.
And that is paid in 2 installments, first half until December, and then in January, the students will pay the second half of the course.
So there's a cost element to this, and it's not inconsiderable, and there's a dedication element in terms of studying for 150 hours. So why is gaining all of that knowledge so important, do you think?
Well, the majority of people who take the course do it because they love their city, and they've come to realize that they don't know their city all that well. And that, as we go along, it doesn't take very many classes for the students to come up to me and say, well, we thought we knew our city, we don't know as much. It is people who enjoy the company of others, who like to show off their city. And to do so, they just need to have all the proper information. Mm-hmm. It's not because you know where the Chateau Frontenac is located or the Parliament buildings that you understand the history of those buildings or those institutions.
Okay, now, so the city has decided to scrap the licence. What effect will this decision by the city have on the tour guide industry here, do you think?
Well, it means that the access to becoming a tour guide will be given to just about anybody. Of course, the employers will be hiring them, but nevertheless, who is going to train these guys? People who want to become guides are not necessarily all history majors. And even though a history major will not necessarily be the best guide, because as a guide, you have to break down the information. This is not When you're doing a tour with tourists, they're on holidays, they're on vacation. They want to be entertained at the same time. They want the knowledge, but they want to enjoy. They're not going to go and write an exam afterwards. So when you take the course, you do get the knowledge. You are helped in how to share that knowledge on each one of the sites. So that means that this duty now will fall on the shoulders of the employers. The employers probably don't always have the capacity to do the proper training. They might have to rely on guides to help and train, but their training will most likely be very limited. They might just ask a guide, you follow a tour 2 or 3 times for 2 hours, 2.5 hours, and then you're on your own. We give 150 hours. So that means that the future guides, unless they do an awful lot of work on their own, might have difficulties understanding the overall history of the city. Because we always try to relate each one of the sites to the overall history. How do these events link together? How do they all come together?
So why do you think the decision was made to do away with the license? What's behind it?
Well, it appears that international tourism to Quebec has increased over the years. In the past, it was many Americans, some Europeans, but now we see the Asian market is coming to Quebec. And the difficulty was to find guides or people in Quebec that could speak Chinese, for example, or Japanese. That was an issue because Chinese and Japanese like to have people, guides that share their culture. So that was one of the main issues would be there. They want their own people to be able to accompany their group throughout the tour of Quebec City. But obviously these people do not have the knowledge to do so. They do not have a permit, a license to guide in Quebec. They cannot come here for 6 months to follow the course. So what we did at St. Lawrence is that we put the course online some 10 years ago, and that was done when the tourist office asked St. Lawrence, because there was a great demand from Japanese wholesalers. They knew that there was a need for Japanese guide with the proper knowledge. So what we did, we put the course online, at first for the Japanese clientele, Japanese guides. And lately, in the last 2 years or so, the majority of guides that have followed the course are Chinese. So in that sense, we seem to be satisfying both groups. The international wholesalers who want their guides to guide in Quebec City, and the city that oblige all guides in Quebec to have a license.
Right.
And hence obtain a permit from the city.
So do you think the tour guides, of which you're one of them and one of many and very experienced, do you think the tour guides here are angry about the decision to do away with the permit, to do away with the license?
Well, they certainly are very disappointed in the sense that Quebec is a World Heritage City. And it is one of the few. As a matter of fact, north of Mexico, Quebec City was the first city to have been honored in such a way as a World Heritage City. The other sites in North America, excluding Mexico, would be the fishing town of Lunenburg in Nova Scotia and parts of the Rideau Canal in Ottawa. All of the other sites in the United States or in Canada are all natural sites. So this is quite an honor for Quebec to be a World Heritage City. That means that, like many other World Heritage cities throughout the world, you want your tourists to understand the history. You don't want it to be improvised with people coming up with these anecdotes. You want them, it's not a history course, but you want a good solid history background. And we talk a lot about the architecture. If you're not properly trained, because we know in North America, Quebec City is just about the oldest city in North America. Much of the architecture dates back to the 19th century, a few buildings to the 18th century. So you do need a solid background. You're not an architect, but nevertheless, you can help people appreciate the architecture. So we want to ensure that all guides have a common knowledge of the city, not one guide saying one thing and somebody else saying something else. If they take a course, they will get basically a lot of the same type of historical information. We are afraid that much of that will be lost because as many of the guides age and all that, many of them, because most of the guides are retired.
Yeah.
They do that for pleasure, even though they are paid for it. They love their city. They love what they are doing. And what people are looking at down the line, it's quite probable that as the older guides, experienced guides, retire, what's going to happen with the new guides coming onto the market? Because each year there are several new guides joining the workforce. They are trained presently. What's going to happen next year and 5 years down the line? I think many people are concerned that we are going to lose something.
So what can today's Quebec City tour guides do about the decision? Is there anything?
I think that one of the solution, may not be the only one, I think St. Lawrence, because it has an online tour guide, that means any guide throughout the world that wants to guide in Quebec City can follow the guide from a distance, and they do it at their own pace. They take the time needed. Some students have done it in 3 months, some take longer. It depends on how available you are and how easy it is for you to study. So that means that we can have people coming from different parts of the world, taking the course, getting a solid knowledge of Quebec, accompanying their groups, and that way I think we satisfied both needs. The need to have knowledgeable guides, and secondly to have guides, Chinese guides accompanying Chinese groups, Japanese guides accompanying Japanese groups, and these people just accompany their groups throughout their trip.
Okay. But usually, if you've done your course, how do you get work here in the city as a guide? You have a permit. Great, you've got a permit. What next?
Well, if you are a local student living in Quebec, we have the meet with the employers sometime in February. So they introduce themselves to the employer, and they get to know the employer, and then they just fix together a meeting. So, and that way, and we've had very good success with that. I know each year the employers have found the guides they need for the coming season, and what they really appreciate about St. Lawrence is that many of the students do speak English. Some it's their mother tongue, others it's their second language, but because they followed the course in English, they have improved their English, and many of them are able to give a solid tour in their second language, that is, in English.
Yes. Tour guiding season in Quebec City, when does it run from and to?
Generally speaking, it starts in May with student groups coming from either the US, other parts of Canada. So large thousands of student groups come here, and it will run all the way through the end of October. The season ends with the cruise ships. So usually end of October, a few groups maybe in early November. That's when you get the vast majority. There's a bit going on in wintertime, a bit during Winter Carnival, but those are on a much smaller scale.
Okay. Now, what types of tours are there?
Well, there are the walking tour, the bus tour, and often a combination of, because because of the narrow streets in Quebec, many buses don't have access to some of these streets. So if it's simply a walking tour, well, that's quite easy to understand. You walk from site to site and you explain in greater detail each one of the sites. When it is a bus tour, often you call those step-on. That means a licensed guide will step on a bus, do the tour, and then drop the tourists off. And then when you have a sort of a partial walking bus tour, well, on certain sites, for example, Place Royale, obviously a bus cannot go to Place Royale, so you get off your bus, you take time to walk through it, and then you get back on your bus and you continue. With a bus tour, you can also extend your tour. That means it's easier for you to go on the Plains of Abraham, for example, to go to the National Assembly, and at times to go a bit further out, Isle of Orleans, the Montmorency Falls. So those are pretty much the type of tours that are frequent in the city. There's some companies that have done a bit of specialized tours. One of them is it can be a bicycle. So some people rent bicycles, they tour the city, so they can cover much larger area because of that. And you also have a company where it's lower town only, you sit two passengers on these little puss-pusses that are drawn by a bicycle at the same time.
Okay, yeah. So, despite the permit not being needed anymore and no need for a license, are you going to be out there guiding next season?
Oh, I have my clientele. I already have an interesting schedule. It's not definite because it all depends on the number of inscriptions, registrations, but it can be expected that there should be a lot of tourists. If it's only because of low Canadian dollar, we may expect larger numbers coming from the U.S. So definitely I'm going to be out in the streets of Quebec with my groups. And I know many of my colleagues also are looking forward to this coming summer. I don't know very many that have decided that it's not for them anymore. They have a passion for this city and they want to share that passion.
So with regards to the lack of permit and then no need for a license now, it'll be interesting to see how this works out for Quebec City Guides next summer. Stephen Marchessault, thanks for speaking to us.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
I'm Andrew Greenfield, and for more news, reviews and opinions, visit lifeinquebec.com.
Thank you for listening to a Life in Quebec podcast. For more news, editorials, and opinion, visit lifeinquebec.com.